Hi, 5th graders. Today we're going to be talking about Module 4, Lesson 17. Our I can statement is I can relate decimal and fraction multiplication. Decimals, if you remember back to the beginning of the year, look like decimal 0.7 or 7/10. It is a number that is between two whole numbers or smaller than 0. So remember, 7/10 would be smaller than one whole. Same thing with a fraction. A fraction is when we have a number that is between two whole numbers or smaller than 0. So 7/10, we would say is 7/10 and would be smaller than one whole. We can convert fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions and go back and forth that way. We're going to look at that and how to do that in a couple minutes. We need to think back, though, to our place value chart. This place value chart is going to help us change decimals to fractions. So let's look at our first example. Our first example is decimal 0.4. I'm going to fill it in my place value chart. How I say decimal 0.4 is 4/10. Now remember, we would say, in your place value chart, tenths looks like 1/10, or the value of tenths is 1/10. Hundredths is 1/100, and a thousandths is 1/1000. So if we have 4/10, we could also write that as 4/10. Because how would you say this fraction as in word form? We would say 4/10. So decimal 0.4 is the same as 4/10. Both of these are 4/10. Let's try it again with our next fraction. The next fraction we are going to work, or the next decimal we're going to work with is decimal 0.17. How would we say this? Well, we would say this as 17/100ths. So if we have 17/100ths, that ends in the hundredths place, which would be 1/100. So hundredths, well, how would we say hundredths? Hundredths is over 100. This is something hundredths. And it is 17/100ths. So it would look like 0.17 or 17/100ths looks like 17/100 or 17/100ths. Notice a pattern? Let's try one more. So if we have our last fraction and that our last decimal, and that's decimal 0.9, or I put it in my place value chart, that is 9/10. Remember, the value of tenths is 1/10. So we would say, okay, well, 9/10 or 9/10. So when we change a decimal to fraction form, we use our place value chart. We write our decimal in the place value chart. And we use our place value chart to say the decimal correctly. So 9/10, 4/10, 17/100ths. However we say that, decimal will help us figure out how to say it as a fraction. So if our decimal ends in the tenths place, it is over 10. If it ends in the hundredths place, it is over 100. Let's add, and I'm going to say, okay, well, 12/100ths. Well, I'm going to find, well, for this, I'm going to think about, okay, well, hundredths would be right here. This is hundredths. And 12/100ths. Well, if I'm saying the word hundredths, that means it ends in the hundredths place. So it would look like this, 12/100ths, or decimal 0.12. So for example, the example we're going to be working with in this video is 3/10 times 4/10. The first way we are going to solve this, or the first step to solving this, again, decimal 0.3 or 3/10 times 4/10. Well, we would change 3/10 to 3/10, right? we would change 4/10 to 4/10. Notice how since I said it correctly, it automatically helps know what my denominator is going to be. Now that I've done step 1, so the grid that we're talking about is this grid right here. So we are going to shade the first factor. Our first factor is 3/10. Now there are 100 little cubes here. But you're going to notice there are 10 rows, which are up and down, and 10 columns. So we have 3/10, which means I'm going to shade 3/10, or 3 of these columns. Now I shaded it vertically instead of horizontally. That's okay. Just make sure you shade it in all 3 columns in one direction. So again, make sure you are copying down this example in your notes. But step 3 would be to shade the second factor, which is 4/10, in the opposite direction. So I'm going to shade 4 columns. So 2, 3, 4. So this is 4/10. I'll label it. And this is 3/10. Okay. Now we can actually look at how much 3/10 and 4/10 is together. Now this 2 colors may remind you of another way we multiplied fractions before. So this is where it gets a little different because we are going to be writing our answer in decimal form and in fraction form. So you already know how to multiply in fraction form, but this grid is helping you find your decimals. So we are going to count how many boxes are both shaded with both red and blue in the same box or overlap. So that'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that would be 12 boxes over, there are 10 boxes, 10 rows this way and 10 rows across. So there are 100 small boxes total. So over 100. So there are 12 100s. Now we can also know how to solve this mathematically because if we multiply across, 3 times 4 is 12. 10 times 10 is 100. So 3/10 times 4/10 is 12 hundredths. Moving on to our last step. So step 5 was this step right here. Now we need to figure out how to write 12 hundredths as a fraction. So I'm going to think, or as a decimal. I'm sorry, not a fraction, as a decimal. I'm going to think back to my place value chart because that means out of 100 pieces, it is 12 pieces colored in, or 12 hundredths. Always double check your work by saying the decimal out loud so you know you have the decimal point in the right place. Because if I had it looking like this, it would be 1.2. I can get my 2 looking like that, not 12 hundredths. Always say it out loud so we know it's in the right place. Good luck, 5th graders. Make sure you ask questions if you need help. We are going to look at this page right here. Whenever you see this screen, pause the video to take notes. Let's write down our I can statement. So at the top of your notebook, write down Module 4, Lesson 17. Then write down I can relate decimal and fraction multiplication. Pause the video until you've copied this down. Now that we have our I can statement, we are going to focus on how to solve decimal multiplication problems. Is going to be to rename decimals to fraction form. So step 1, write down, rename decimals to fraction form. Pause the video till you have step 1 written down. Notes. All right, so pause this video until you have written down these notes. But we are going to use the place value chart to write in the decimal. the place value of the last digit helps decide the denominator. And the denominator will always be 10, 100, or 1,000. Once you've copied this down, you may press play. So now we're ready to actually solve. Let's look at our example. I can move on to step 2. Pause the video to write down step 2. We are going to shade the first factor horizontally in that grid. Write it down, then press play. Now we're going to move on to step 3. Our third step is to shade the second factor in the opposite direction on the grid. So make sure you're copying down the example as you go. But that is that we're going to shade our second factor, which is 4/10. So copy down step 3 and play the video when you are ready. So again, we're going to move on to our next step. So our next step, step 4, pause the video while you copy this down, is to find where the colors overlap and count how many boxes there are. Would be, we're going to go over here and we are going to write down our numerator, right? Would be how many are both shaded in both colors, and our denominator is how many boxes total. So let's add this to our notes. Our numerator is how many boxes with both colors and both. So overlapping, not blue or red, overlapping. And our denominator is how many boxes total. Copy this down, play the video when you're ready. So we're going to write down step 5, which would be to solve mathematically by multiplying across. We already did this on the last slide. Write this down, then play the video when you're ready.